This scene from X-Men Origins Wolverine got a pretty bad rap when it came out. With the upcoming release for the new Deadpool and Wolverine film, there's a number of very cool close-ups of Wolverine's claws in the trailers. And this got me thinking, how difficult is it actually to make some photorealistic Wolverine claws? So, here's my attempt. If I had to guess, I would imagine the problem with that Wolverine film was that the proper data wasn't captured on set to rebuild the reflections. So during the filming of my scene, I made a conscious effort to take down some notes and measurements that would help with this later in the process. First of all, to get the shot, I just set up my camera on the floor. I'm mimicking the same camera angle as that shot from the trailer where it's looking up at his hand. Once I was happy with the shot, it was time for a costume change because I've never seen Wolverine wearing running shorts. Now looking a bit more dressed for the part, I put lots of tracking markers on my hand to assist with the object tracking later on. Once everything's ready to go, I just did a few takes of the hand movement, just to give myself some options when editing so I could pick the best one. Then, with the main plate filmed, I captured the all-important data. I shot a couple of extra plates which include a colour chart for matching the colour of the CG later, as well as a plate of me just holding a normal kitchen knife in the same spot. I did this to give myself a good reference of what this kind of metallic material looks like in this lighting setup in front of the camera from this specific angle. I also measured the distance from the camera to my hand so I could get the scale of the CG scene to be correct. And lastly, I took a high dynamic range image of my scene so I could capture all the lighting data in the room and use this to rebuild the reflections and the lighting later in Blender. Then with the filming done, it's time to jump into the digital world and make some magic. I started out by making a mood board with a couple of screenshots from the trailers. These came in really handy while modelling to get the shape of the claws correct. It looks like quite a simple model, but it's quite deceiving. Getting the contours and the sharp edges exactly right took a little bit of work. I modelled it in a low poly version first, and then applied a subdivision surface modifier and added some loop cuts to maintain the sharpness of the edges. And this is the result. For texturing, there's hundreds of metallic PBR textures online. I ended up going for a very clean looking brushed metal texture. After adding some quick seams to my model, I was able to unwrap it and then apply the texture to the UVs. I changed the scale slightly in the mapping node until the size of the texture looked correct on the model, and then added a colour ramp onto the roughness, and then tweaked the black and white points until I got the correct amount of shininess that I was looking for. Then in Nuke, I start preparing the HDRI and exporting any background plates to Blender. I start by using an ST map and use that to undistort the footage. Once undistorted, I reformat it down to half res and export this as a background plate that I use on my camera in Blender. Then I also exported a full res EXR sequence of the undistorted plate. I want this to be the maximum quality because this will be what I'm doing the object tracking on. In Blender, I then add an object track, punch in my camera parameters like my focal length and sensor size, and then start tracking all the markers on my fingers and hands. I didn't move around a great deal, so it's not a particularly complicated object track. Once I had enough points, I set up a camera in my scene, set the focal length to be correct, and eyeballed the rotation to match the position of my real camera. Then if I enable the motion tracking overlays, I can see where my points are in 3D space. I then created a cube and made it the exact size of the distance between two of the tracking markers on my knuckles, and then scaled my camera and 3D scene around that point so that the scale of the CG hand and claws would be real world accurate. Then I added a second cube and subdivided it slightly and sculpted a rough piece of geometry for the hand. I made a better version of this later in the process. This was just a temporary version while setting up the position of the claws. Then I append in the model of the claw that I made in a separate Blender file, and then I hopped back into Nuke to process the HDRI. I first use a spherical transform node, which takes the HDRI out of equirectangular mode and maps it in a slightly more usable way. Then I can tilt the view down until I'm looking at the color chart on the floor, and then I use a third-party node called Color Target, which allows you to overlay a digital version of the color chart dots onto your real color chart, and then Nuke will do an inverse color grade on your plate to take it from the current colors in your scene to a completely neutralized version. This is incredibly handy when working with different cameras because neutralizing your plates means that all the cameras have exactly the same color. This is pretty essential when it comes to creating photorealistic CG, as it takes out all of the guesswork and makes it much more mathematical and scientifically accurate. I then also do a quick bit of cleanup just to remove the feet of the monopod from the HDRI and also the color chart on the floor. Then I export the cleaned up neutral grade HDRI to use in Blender. I bring this in as my world texture and orient it to be correctly aligned with the camera so that the reflections map correctly onto my CG object. Wolverine obviously has 3 claws, not 1, so I duplicated this a couple of times and positioned it between the knuckles. I then brought in a digital version of my color chart and set this up in front of the camera, and by sampling the grey values between the two, I can make sure my scene is correctly exposed in Blender. As you can see here, I sample the middle grey square in Nuke first. I actually forgot to apply the neutral grade to this, so I used Color Target again to sample this plate of the chart. Then I noted down the RGB values of the grey square after the neutral grade is applied. And then back in Blender, I can render one frame of my CG color chart, sample the grey values of the render, and then increase the strength of the HDRI as needed until the exposures match. It's a slightly more involved process than eyeballing it, but it takes out all of the guesswork in terms of color correction and exposure, so it's definitely worth doing to achieve the best results, and this is a totally professional workflow. Then I unwrapped the model of the hand that I made, and projected a frame from the plate onto it so that it would have the same texture as my real hand. You can see here if I turn that texture on and off, just how much of my hand you actually see reflected in the claws when this is done properly. Then obviously the claws need some animation, so I did a few keyframes animating them to go back up into my arm, and just refining the position on every frame so they're always coming out the same part of the knuckles. Then at the end of the shot they go back in, so I'm doing this process in reverse and animating them to go back up. Then I set the hand to a holdout so it would occlude the claws when they're passing through, and did a first render just to put this together in Nuke and see how it looks. This is what the render looks like with no comp work, just putting it straight on top of my footage. Rather than making a holdout for the entire arm, it was just easier to make a mask in Nuke and exclude the bits of the claws that I didn't want to see once they'd passed through the hand. Currently, the CG has been rendered with the neutral grade of the HDRI, but I haven't applied the neutral grade to my plate. Instead of also neutral grading the footage of me, which is a bit detrimental to your footage, and is bad practice to affect the in-camera plate. Instead, the beauty of this color chart process is I can take a node with that color transform baked in and then invert it, which will then take anything with the neutral grade and then apply the exact color data from the plate of me onto the CGI. Sounds a bit complicated, but it's essentially just inverting that process, and as you can see, the claws now look perfectly color matched to the shot of me. At this point, I made a better model of the hand. It's going to be a shadow catcher as well as a holdout, so I wanted the geometry to be fairly accurate. I used some metaballs just to block out the shape of my knuckles and fingers. Then I joined them all into one mesh, remeshed this in sculpt mode, and then used some of the sculpting brushes just to tweak the shape where needed. I also then took the time to make a clean frame for the hand projection without the tracking markers on it. I just did this on one frame and just quickly painted out all of the markers using the clone tool, and then exported this as an EXR. And then brought that into Blender, used the project from view unwrap on the hand from the camera's perspective, and then applied that texture to the new hand model. And as you can see now, the tracking markers no longer appear in the reflected version of my hand. Obviously we don't want to see them in the final version. I then set the new hand model to be a shadow catcher and did another quick render just to see how this was looking in Nuke. Once I updated the render in Nuke, I can then shuffle out the shadow catcher pass and multiply this over my hand before the CG claws. And this will apply all of the shadow and ambient occlusion data, which really helps to make the claws feel connected to my hand and less floaty like they are in the initial Wolverine film. Then, to make the reflections even more realistic, I took this a step further and projected the texture of my entire body onto a rough 3D model. Currently the scene is set up and lit just using the HDRI, but my body isn't in the HDRI, so currently we're not seeing any of my jeans or my jacket reflected in the claws. Annoyingly, setting the model of the body to indirect only so it didn't show up in the render actually affected the shadow catcher of the hand. So I ended up putting these into separate collections and rendering the shadow completely independently instead of baked into the EXR sequence using the shadow catcher render layer. It achieves pretty much exactly the same result, but I've split them up into completely separate renders so I can turn off any collections that are affecting the shadow catchers independently. This is what the previous render looked like without the model of the body reflected in the claws, and this is what it looks like now. At this point the CG is more or less done, so I start to finesse the compositing. Here I'm adding a very slight amount of defocus just to match the sharpness of the CG render to the sharpness of my hand. Then, because the depth of field in this shot is quite shallow, I'm also doing a 3D defocus. What I'm doing right now is doing an edge extend on the depth pass that I rendered from Blender, so that there's no strange values on the edge of the depth pass that will cause some defocusing artifacts. Once I've applied this treatment to the depth pass, I can then shuffle this back in, and set my desired focal distance within the bokeh node, and then just turn up the defocus to taste until there's some nice defocus falling off at the end of the claws when they get closer to camera. I'm also doing some last minute black and white point adjustments. The color chart process gets it pretty much all the way there. I just made a couple of tweaks just to make the highlights on the claws ping slightly more, so I made them a little bit brighter. I also added a very subtle glow just to mimic some bloom coming off the hottest highlights. Then I finally plucked up the courage to remove all of these tracking markers. With the beauty of editing, they disappear just like that, but the reality is I spent about 20 minutes tracking the different sections and then transforming the pixels nearby over the top and then grading them as necessary to remove the markers. For an additional level of detail, I wanted to add a couple of frames where the holes that the claws had made were closing up in the hand. So I jumped onto textures.com and found a texture of some meat. I'm vegetarian, so this image was actually slightly nauseating to look at. I cut out a small section, color graded it slightly to get the desired effect, and then used a fractal blur on the edges just to roughen them up slightly with some noise, and then transformed and animated this into place. So as the claws disappear, there's just about 2 frames where there's some lingering cuts on the knuckles that are disappearing. Now at this point, I actually thought I was done. Whenever I think a shot is finished, I just watch it on loop for a few minutes, and I was staring at it just thinking something's not quite right, and then I realised, here in the original shot you can see my hand, and then the shadow of my hand on my leg, and then in the final comp you can see the claws and no claw shadow on my leg. So I just placed a massive cylinder in the scene to go where my leg was. Doesn't need to be super precise, it's just something to catch the shadow. The HDRI wasn't quite producing sharp enough shadows for this, so I actually went in and added an additional area light into my scene. I set the size to be quite small so that the claw shadows would match the sharpness to the actual plate, set the cylinder to a shadow catcher and rendered this out as a third separate render pass. Then I dropped this into Nuke, and the final thing to do is just make sure it's isolated to that part of my leg. The model for the shadow catcher in 3D wasn't very precise, it was just the curved face of the cylinder. I did a 2-point track on my leg and then used this to track any masks onto my leg. I was going to completely roto it, and then I realised that my front leg was actually a lot brighter than my back leg, and I thought, work smarter not harder. So I did a luminance key on my leg and was able to pull about 90% of the outline of the leg just from the luma key. Then I did a quick mask just to get any bits that the key didn't pick up, and then used that entire alpha that I just created as a mask for where the shadow catcher would go. There's a bit of overlap at the top where the claw shadow is then going on top of the original shadow from the plate, which obviously isn't photorealistic because they're from the same light source. So I did a mask as well around the original shadow of my hand so that the CG shadows from the claw are occluded from that area. Blurred it a little bit so that the edges blend in nicely. And that was the final stage for the VFX work. Then for the final cherry on top, I jumped into Resolve and gave it a nice color grade to really bring it to life. And with all of that work done, again, this is what the final result looks like. I hope you think it looks cool. I think it holds up really well, even against the claws in the Deadpool trailer, which is some great VFX work. If you're interested, the project files from this video are available on my Patreon. You can download all of the footage that I used in this video, the 3D model of the claws, the HDRI, the blender scene with the animation. It's all on there for you to have a play with. Leave a comment below for what effect I should try next. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.